Good morning in the Americas, good afternoon in Europe and Africa, good evening in Australia. It is fantastic to see an audience signed in from Canada, from the United States, from Poland, from the United Kingdom, from Malaysia, from Germany, from Spain, from Russia, from Greece, Algeria, Germany, Ghana, France, Qatar, Japan, Iran, Argentina, the Netherlands, Indonesia, and South Africa, because that is simply how international the energy industry is, and that is simply how international the gas industry is. Today's webinar is hosted by the IGU from London, where the future headquarters of the IGU will be, from Moscow, the gas capital of the world, from Toronto, which is our case study, and from Paris, which is the headquarters of the International Energy Agency. There's great urgency and pressure for governments and companies to deliver on the most ambitious industrial and societal transition of our time. And the fact that we are this year seeing the US Climate Summit in April, the IEA announcement of pathways to net zero, the COP26 in Glasgow at the end of this year, all indicate that it's key. At the same time, there remains continued need for reliable supply of energy, especially obvious in extreme winter periods, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. This winter saw some record-breaking temperatures, some skyrocketing energy demand and prices throughout the Northern Hemisphere, and that made power system reliability and energy prices a key concern. We're all reminded about the challenges of ensuring reliable power and energy supply last month in Texas that is still being so widely debated. And it is clear that rapid energy transitions combined with more unpredictable weather will put pressure on the reliability and test industry, the energy supply industry, will test our planners, will test our operators all over the world. And today we have an excellent panel of experts that will help us to explore electricity and energy reliability as we speak about lessons and best practices from the Canadian province of Ontario. Allow me to introduce them. Firstly, we have Usman Saeed. Usman is the Director of Conservation and Energy Efficiency at the Ontario Ministry of Energy. He's responsible for policy implementation of the province's electricity and natural gas conservation programs and frameworks, as well as Ontario's energy efficiency standards and regulation. And prior to this important role, he led various initiatives with the Ministry of Energy in the same province of Canada, including the implementation of smart meters of time of use pricing and the design and launch of Ontario's Smart Grid Fund. Sitting right next to him, also speaking from Ontario and Toronto, is Chuck Farmer. Chuck is the Senior Director, Power System Planning of the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. And he joined the gas industry initially focusing on residential and commercial markets. And then in 2005, when a lot of the change that we'll be discussing today, Chuck was appointed as the Director of Market Knowledge and Demand Side Management at Union Gas. And after that, Chuck became at the Ontario Power Planning Authority that he joined. He held senior roles in conservation, in corporate relations and power system planning, looking into the future. In his current role, Chuck leads the planning of Ontario's electricity system, and he focuses on the adequacy of the electricity supply and the transmission system to make sure that the system needs are met and that there are various options to meet them. And then our third panelist speaking from Paris today is Peter Fraser. Peter is the head of gas and coal and power markets division at the International Energy Agency. And Peter has 30 years of experience in energy policy, about a third of it with the International Energy Agency. And before that, he was also in Ontario and split his time between the Energy Ministry and the Energy Regulator in various assignments. And quite famously, he is the co-author of the 2009 article, which was titled, "Ontario, the road off coal is paved with speed bumps." So very well qualified to speak today, and he brings a global perspective to today's discussions but he uniquely also happens to know the case that we are going to be discussing today firsthand. Could we have the next picture, please? Now, today, we want the audience to be participative, and the panelists and I are going to speak for about 40 minutes, and we're leaving 20 minutes at the end for audience questions. Please enter them in the questions line in your screen, and we hope to see a full bunch of questions, tough questions, probing questions, so that that we can all learn maximally from today. Today, the IGU is releasing a report looking at lessons for successful energy transitions. This focuses on the province of Ontario in Canada, which went through a rapid transition to a clean and reliable energy system, and to this day enjoys high reliability, in part due to the gentlemen that are on our panel today. In fact, Ontario replaced a quarter of its power generation capacity in under a decade, eliminating coal, pioneering conservation, and restructuring the market. And what we see is that Ontario, in the period 2003 to 2014, phased out its coal from 7,587 megawatts of capacity to zero. If you say, but that's a long time ago, yes, the timescales of effecting change in power systems are long, and the impacts are felt a lot longer afterwards. And on the right-hand side, we see from the report that capacity was replaced by 1,500 megawatts of nuclear, 5,500 megawatts of natural gas, and 5,500 megawatts of non-renewable, non-hydro renewables, solar and wind. And that phased approach worked very well, as we will see in a moment. But the main driver for that change was to improve the greenhouse gas emissions profile of the province and to cut air pollution. And if we look back over the same period, it is unequivocally clear that we see in blue how NOx reduced from 100% on the left down to by 80% to just 20% of the original levels. SOx reduced in green to zero by eliminating coal, and how the greenhouse gas profile of the state of the province of Ontario improved. A fantastic outcome in cutting greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution between 80 and 90%. Extreme, as is so topical and being discussed today, extreme weather plays an important part of energy supply and reliability in all the northern countries of the world, but no more so than in Ontario. And what we see on front of us is that the Toronto Star reported on the 5th of January 2018 that Toronto broke the record for cold weather on January the 5th. And on the right-hand side, we see how the various generation sources contributed to making sure that the lights stayed on in Ontario. We can see in red the 10,000 megawatts of nuclear. We can see the 5,000 megawatts of hydro above that. We can see the contribution of wind on the 5th of January in gray. You can see the small contributions in the harsh Canadian winter of solar in a short period of the day, and also the contribution of biofuel. And then we see the way in which gas right at the top in blue met the demand. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see the megawatts of maximum demand. On the right-hand side, you see the rate of change in the output of gas. You can see how that stepped up in the early morning by 100% with the sharp peak, and you can see in the afternoon how it could load follow overall to make sure that the system stayed balanced in Ontario. A fantastic outcome that one can see the fulsome picture of as it has evolved. If we then look at what were the lessons that are detailed in the IGU report on this case study. The first one is that a diversity of tools and primary energy resources are necessary to make sure that power system reliability works. The second one is that planning plays an absolutely key role, supported by policy, supported by the power system, supported by not a 5-year look, not a 10-year look, but a 15-year look at the future. What is clear from the report are that pain points need to be addressed, and that the interconnected infrastructure of both gas pipelines and transmission needs to address that. That pricing signals need to be right to respond, and as we've seen in Japan in the past months, in Texas in the past months, and in Europe in the past months. And last but not least, as the International Energy Agency is so clear about, the demand management and conservation programs play such an important role. On that basis, and speaking with demand management, looking back to 2006, but also forward to 2034, you can see how important Canada and the province of Ontario deems conservation programs to deliver savings that impact both capacity required, but also savings that require the overall energy consumption. Because if we are to be successful in reducing the carbon load on our atmosphere, we need to take energy demand out. And we can see, as Usman Saeed will speak to in a moment, the various codes and standards that apply within the province in the past and into the future. A fantastic overview. And on that basis, that's a perfect segue to introduce Usman Saeed to take us through, and we're going to start deliberately with conservation, savings, and energy efficiency. Over to you, Usman.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and also thanks to your team at the IGU for organizing this event and preparing a very comprehensive and positive case study on our province. So thanks for that. What I'd like to offer over perhaps the next 12 minutes or so is a deeper dive into how energy efficiency policies and programs have contributed to a reliable and clean supply mix in Ontario. And what I'd like to leave you with today is perhaps more of an understanding of how Ontario is building on these policies with investments and initiatives to meet both changing system needs and customer experiences. As the IGU report notes, Ontario is large. So if you look at a map here, it's actually the size of Germany and France combined. But most of our population is concentrated near the US border, so right at the south of the province. And one of the challenges for energy security and reliability, as well as affordability, is meeting the needs of this geographically dispersed population that really puts a strain on the system at different times. From an energy efficiency programs perspective, that means that we're always having to consider regional approaches and measures, because they can have vastly different impacts depending on where you are in the province. When you look at the electricity supply mix, it was in 2020 93% free of emitting generation, and I'd say that's pretty good. This clean mix, though, is really made possible by a few factors. One is obviously the end of coal-fired generation, which was accomplished in 2014. Second was an investment in a diverse and clean supply mix, which I'm sure Chuck will talk a little bit more about. But the third reason, and really the focus of my talk, is the ramp up of energy efficiency programs and advancements in the provincial codes and standards. In 2005, we started to invest in province-wide programs for energy efficiency and continued on the path of setting increasingly stringent energy efficiency standards for products and appliances. When you fast forward to 2019, energy efficiency savings were estimated to have reduced provincial demand by 12%, which makes up almost 2/3 of the lost generation from coal. So now I'll talk a little bit about the how. So how we achieve these energy efficiency savings in the province. And the diagram you see on this slide really shows how the initiatives work together. We have energy efficiency incentive programs, which encompass both natural gas and electricity, as well as grants to municipalities for developing energy conservation plans. We also have building codes and product efficiency standards, which actually predated the provincial programs, but now they really serve to lock in the savings that we achieve from the programs. Ontario also made a comparatively early investment in smart meters, so we have about 90% of our residential and small business customers paying time of use rates. And as you know, this is really intended to encourage conservation and demand management. And we've also put into place mandatory energy reporting for large private and broader public sector buildings who have to report their usage annually. So through all these initiatives, we try to change the behavior and enable energy efficiency to compete on its own standing without incentives and against other generation and other resources in the market, or as a solution that utilities could pursue when it's cheaper than poles and wires investments. So when I look across the energy system and take a look at where energy efficiency is actually achieved, first you take a look at the provincial planning and operation view. Electricity system planners take into consideration the forecasted savings from energy efficiency initiatives when they plan the supply to meet the forecasted demand. And system operators can also use resources like demand response from an energy transmission and distribution system perspective. You can make investments in monitoring and controls, other technologies to help reduce line losses when conveying electricity or natural gas to customers. And in buildings and at the customer level, this is probably the most common when you think about energy efficiency. We have upgrades and investments in more efficient equipment, improvements in building envelopes, improvements in process systems, business operations, and new technologies. So really across the system, there are several points at which you can implement energy efficiency programs or initiatives to really improve that reliability. So when we put this all together and you look at the, can you go to the next slide, please, Tatiana? Yeah. So when we put this all together and you look at energy efficiency programs and codes and standards, they're expected to decrease gross level demand in the province by approximately 12% in 2040. So really continuing their current trajectory of savings. So the way we deploy all of the energy efficiency programs are through conservation frameworks. So what is a framework? It's really the rules, the guidelines and processes that reflect the government policy and objectives and the funding that's approved to spend on these programs. We have to date two separate frameworks. One is for electricity and the other is for natural gas. The frameworks overseeing these programs have different governance structures, considering that there's different oversight versus electricity and natural gas that's established in legislation. However, ultimately, both have fundamental goals to remove barriers to conservation investments and to assist customers in reducing their bills. The programs are relied on by a large cross-section of customers, from low-income customers to large industrials, mining companies, etc. So this slide really shows how the current levels of program investments could contribute to system needs over the next 20 years. Obviously, these are forecasts only, but they do speak to the role that energy efficiency programs have in meeting system and customer needs, and we'll look to align investments with changes in those variables over time. So when I look at the frameworks closer, and in this case, electricity, under the current government, electricity conservation and demand management were refocused and centralized starting in 2019. And conservation is now more closely targeting system needs. And programs are being offered to those folks that are most in need, including with the focus on business programs, low-income residential programs, and on-reserve First Nation customers. The latest framework for electricity was launched on January 1st of this year, and it really has a greater focus on meeting the forecasted capacity needs and an objective to increase greater competition. Now on the slide, I just highlight a few of the programs that are offered under this framework, but what I really want to draw your attention to is the low cost of these programs, which are effectively delivered at 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So when you start comparing that to the cost of procuring and developing new generation sources, it really doesn't even come close. Outside of the CDM frameworks, Ontario is piloting an energy efficiency auction to help inform future competitive procurement approaches for conservation, and that auction is open to projects in all sectors. So just looking at the natural gas framework, Ontario, again, is making significant investments in natural gas programs. In fact, the current framework has double the budget than the previous natural gas framework, and there are programs available for all customer segments. So the programs are focused on lowering natural gas bills, but increasingly, there's an objective to help contribute to the province's GHG reduction goals. And the Ontario Energy Board, who's the province's regulator, has set out expectations for Enbridge, who's the primary deliverer of natural gas to Ontarians, that they pursue a modest budget increase in the next framework that's currently under development. And the real reason behind that is to contribute towards the province's GHG reductions. So if we look at the future and what's coming up in Ontario in regards to energy efficiency, we're really considering ways to enable greater consumer choice. We want to build on the possibilities of increased digitization. And we know that the customers are overwhelmingly, they want and expect more digital tools. And they compare the utility industry with their experiences in other industries. And providing customers with a simple and straightforward energy consumption data is really key to promoting energy efficiency practices. So a few of the things we're looking at, one is called Green Button, and this is something we're proposing to require provincial electricity and natural gas utilities to implement. It's a data standard, and that standard would allow households and businesses to access their data in a common format and then share that data with applications or software of their choice, really to help them analyze their energy usage and identify conservation opportunities. We're also looking at customer choice in rate plans. So we are supporting greater choice through more innovative rate plans. And the OEB, the Ontario Energy Board, has piloted and is now analyzing the results from different time of use rate structures, including low overnight prices for electric vehicle owners and critical peak pricing as well. And these could really inform the introduction of additional rate plans in the future. And lastly, also looking at energy efficiency as a distributed energy resource, our system operator, the ISO, and the regulator, the OEB, are actively studying and consulting on ways to effectively enable and integrate DERs, and that's something that we need to closely follow and understand the need for future policy changes. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. I look forward to the panel discussion, and I'll pass it over to Chuck.
So thank you, Usman, for that. And it is very important as a planner in the province that we do rely on things like energy efficiency to achieve our goals. As I think about the journey from about 2002 to today, I think planners have made a bit of a journey on that front. We certainly weren't that maybe as committed to energy efficiency in the early days of planning, but over the 20 years we've experienced a real sort of benefit from pursuing these energy efficiency programs, and we've seen the real outcomes. I think as energy efficiency moves forward, it will start to sort of broaden and cross fuels, and as we think about the different challenges that we will be taking on, it might start to become an exercise not of reducing energy use in specific areas, but really an exercise of thinking about the best fuel for the task. given the overall policy objectives that we are seeing for energy systems in general. So first, I'd like to compliment the IGU. I think the report presented captures the situation in Ontario very well. It stresses strong policy, independent planning, and independent regulation as being very important inputs. I think also it was very important to have a strong core of actors. So you had the independent planners, you had the regulators, a strong transmission company that owned most of the transmission, so was able to affect policy quite effectively. And a lot of the generation was owned by Ontario Power Generation, who are owned by the Government of Ontario. And in particular, all of the coal generation was owned by Ontario Power Generation. So that also contributed to the ability to be able to phase it out in the time that we were able. If you cast forward to today, our generation mix is much more owned by private power producers, and so you have a broader set of actors that would be required to affect change as we go forward. We also have a very diverse fuel mix. We have very clean electricity supply. It has been pointed out that in last year, we produced more than 90% of our electricity production from non-emitting resources, and our annual emissions from the electricity sector run around 5 megatons per year, which is significantly lower than we had in 2005. But I think more context is required for what happened over the last 20 years and really is required to understand the supply mix that we have today in Ontario and to understand the challenges that I think we face going forward, which is where I would like to focus more of my attention. So what we have to remember is that off coal was really just one policy driving the evolution of the system, and that several other policies were actually in play. As we got into around 2004, 2005, after the markets had opened, we clearly had an infrastructure deficit in the electricity system, and we're very heavily dependent on imports in the early 2000s. And so significant investments being identified as being required to restore the reliability of the fleet and get it back to the reliability standards that we require. The off-coal announcements were starting up about that time, so that added a layer of complexity to restoring the infrastructure deficit, because now you had to think about where the coal plants were located and the services that they provided. So you're not just putting capacity back in the system, but you're putting in capacity that has certain operability characteristics to maintain reliability. And as we go into the process, we then have the next layer of policy direction, which is the Green Energy and Green Economy Act, which happens around 2008. And that was really established to set goals for the take-up of non-hydro renewables, to establish very aggressive programs to accelerate the take-up of those things through tariff programs and similar supports, and really was starting to create another layer of complexity on the system, in that we're adding wind and solar at a relatively rapid clip. But as we all know, those are intermittent resources. They can be fuel limited. And so you're adding a reliability challenge to that, which was really an issue that the operator had to deal with at the time. And we also having a rapid take-up of distributed energy and renewable energy. So refurbishment of the nuclear fleet is the other thing that was hanging out there. And we have a very strong backbone of nuclear energy in the province. And so what we were approaching was the end of life of those, or at least the end of their first phase of life, if I can call it that. And we knew that we were facing a significant refurbishment program with about 10 units, each around 800 megawatts, scheduled to be refurbished over about a 10 to 15 year period. And refurbishments take about 2 to 3 years per unit. So we've also got to allow for a period of time starting around 2017, where you will have much reduced nuclear energy coming into the system for about that period of 10 to 15 years. And on top of that, one of our nuclear plants at Pickering, just east of Toronto, it's currently about 3,000 megawatts of capacity, produces more than terawatt hours of energy. And it is getting to the end of its life. And so we were preparing for the retirement of Pickering. So you've got off coal as a driver, you've got the enhancements of renewable energy as a driver, you've got the preparation for the next phase of the nuclear fleet as a driver, and you have a retirement of a large generator, a very significant generator on the system as a driver. So where are we now, having gone through all of that? Well, in good shape. as your report shows, but I think we are about to face some similar challenges to the challenges that we saw in the off-coal period. So firstly, let's think a little bit about demand in Ontario, and the report correctly described the decline in demand from the early 2000s, and that helped a lot with the challenges that are described. And Usman laid out the significant contribution made by conservation programs. But what we also had was a significant shift in the economy. We did have a lot of heavy industry that closed in Ontario. So our industrial sector, which used to be about a third of our demand for electricity, now is running around 18 to 20% of our electricity demand. And I think the financial crisis probably was sort of the last sort of act in that sort of transition of the economy, where it really sort of ended the last of the turnover in the industrial sector. But since then, we have seen quite a resilient industrial sector. We see some very promising signs in Ontario for investment. So perhaps some growth in the industrial sector and in certain targeted sectors like mining, and also in the agricultural sector with intensive greenhouse loads really being developed in the southwest of our province. We're starting to see some upward pressure in the demand for electricity. So we're moving, I think, through the bottom of the decline, and we're starting to see the growth return. Also supported by things like some trends in the residential sector. We're very interested in how this pandemic has shifted the way people use electricity, with more people working from home. We're seeing trends that were starting to occur before, with much more in the way of online shopping, which were really changing the way electricity was used. And as the pandemic hopefully moves through the final phase and vaccinations become available, it will be interesting to see how those trends take hold. But we do expect some upward pressure, particularly in our residential sector. And we have very significant electrification of our transportation networks underway. We have about 7 million light passenger vehicles in the province registered. About 44,000 of them are electric right now. There are substantial supports for the development of electric vehicles with build out of charging networks, and we think that could rise to about 1 million electric vehicles by about 2035, and significant transit investments. So all of this means that we think demand will increase, which will represent a bit of a challenge for the system. And then so on to the installed capacity and what happened with the supply mix over the last number of years and what we see moving forward. So you can see here from 2005, the mix was relatively straightforward. It was a very strong backbone of nuclear, a significant hydro. We have pretty much tapped all of the hydroelectric that we can in the province. We have quite a flat province, so we don't have the opportunity for large hydroelectric projects. We do have still maybe some run-of-river potential and substantial production at Niagara Falls. So we have the hydroelectric. We had some gas running in the province and a large coal contribution. And as you move forward into 2010, the coal phase-out program is underway. The restoration of reliability is underway, and we start to see the introduction of the non-hydro renewables, primarily wind and solar, starting to come into the mix, and the installed capacity of gas growing very, very quickly. We invested in a lot of natural gas capacity over that period, largely combined cycles, and we did that for a reason that I'll get to in a moment. But we've about 11,000 megawatts of gas capacity added with the last unit coming online around 2020. So we're doing that, and as we move forward to 2015, you see that the last of the coal plants has retired, and that happened actually just around the beginning of 2014 with our last plant in Northwest Ontario. So now our plant is relying on natural gas to provide the flexibility. It is utilizing wind and solar to reduce the demand for the use of emitting resources, and we're relying very heavily on our nuclear fleet, which is about to go into refurbishment. And you can see that as we cast forward, now we don't expect to make a lot of investments in capacity on the system. We do have a small capacity deficit that we see emerging right around 2026. With the retirement of the Pickering station. but we are leaning on the gas plants to be able to provide the contribution of energy going forward. And what we see today is sort of similar challenges to what we saw as we moved through that coal phase out period. So if you can think about the rapid introduction of renewable energy on the fleet, then as a system operator, we have to figure out how to operate the system with things that you cannot predict, as well as the sort of traditional resources. You know, nuclear pretty well running all the time. Gas is there when you call it. We have very strong fuel security. Coal fleet's very flexible. We're now trying to adjust to something new, and so there were a lot of work done with the sector, with the development of ability to forecast renewable energy, so that we could manage the system. And so we see ourselves in a similar position today. Funnily enough, we understand renewables quite well. We understand wind and solar, and we've got good forecasting. We know how to account for them and to be prepared for them to either come on or go off. But we sit here with new technology starting to face us. So we see a lot of storage being proposed on the system, and I believe that storage will be a very significant contributor to the future. But again, we're sitting here today in a similar way to the way we were with renewable energy in about 2010, saying, well, how does it work? You know, what is it really capable of doing? We've looked at some jurisdictions around us where they've had some experience with it, and as with every new resource, its performance in actual system operations will differ from the way it is expected to perform, and it will take some experience to be able to get confident with storage as a way to go forward. But again, I do believe that this will be a very significant contributor to capacity as we go forward. So our slide on energy production sort of tells a different story, and it says sort of where we are today, but more importantly, where we're going. And again, so if you look at the energy production, and you can see that phase out of energy produced from the coal fleet quite significantly happening. And if you recall on the last slide, you had very large buildouts of natural gas capacity. If I can just go back one slide, please. We have very large buildouts of gas capacity, but you can see in 2015 and 2020 that in reality, the gas fleet is not running very much. And this is because the gas fleet was put in place partly to restore the reliability, to give us the flexibility that you talked about in your report, but also to prepare for the nuclear refurbishment period. And so as we go forward, we see the nuclear capability bouncing around because nuclear units are coming out for refurbishment and also retiring. And you see the gas fleet start to really increase its production. And this is by design. We saw the gas fleet, the characteristics of combined cycle turbines as being able to replace the nuclear supply and take us through that period. And we had always seen that as being a somewhat temporary sort of investment that, that the nuclear would return, and because demand had traditionally been quite flat, that would then back the gas turbines, the gas production off a bit. But now as we see increasing demand in the province and the need to meet that demand, we think the reliance on natural gas will continue for some period of time. Which really leads to what I think is the challenge that the sector is starting to face, which is the emissions projection. And in your chart, you saw very clearly the decline in emissions as we went through the coal phase out period, as we added the significant amount of renewable energy on the fleet. And as we did not rely on the gas fleet primarily for energy, but we were relying on it for its flexibility and its capability to produce at peak, so running it relatively little. But as we cast forward, we have a couple scenarios here. We can see that emissions will start to rise because more and more of our energy production is expected to come from natural gas unless something changes in the supply mix. And as we move to more competitive ways of acquiring supply, I see here great opportunities for non-emitting technologies to compete with the gas fleet to provide production, and that may suppress this. But what we do have, because of these projections that we put out, and we update our projections on an annual basis, is concern about the rising emissions of the electricity system generation. And actually, a number of municipalities in Ontario have recently passed resolutions calling for the phase out of gas from the system over the next 10 years, which, while I would say as a system operator is probably not impossible, but is challenging because we can learn from the coal phase out experience. It doesn't take into account the overall picture of emissions in the economy and how we might spend dollars to get the best outcomes. But it is a very vocal lobby. And to be honest, it feels a lot like the discussion that was happening in 2002, which led to the phase out of coal. And with that, I will turn it to Peter.
Move to Peter. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks to Usman and Chuck for the really good introduction to these topics, and to you, Andy, for organizing this today. I'm with the International Energy Agency, and we see ourselves as the intergovernmental organization leading clean energy transitions. And certainly when you talk about clean energy transitions, the role of coal, in particular coal-fired power generation, is certainly one that jumps to top of mind. And I would suggest, certainly our recent analysis suggests that when we look at coal power plants around the world, not just in Ontario, that existing plants that we need to do at least one of the three following things, kind of our 3 R's principles when it comes to coal plants. In some cases, particularly with the rise of variable renewables in many power systems, coal plants could be repurposed to operate more flexibly and support greater shares of renewables in the system. Second, particularly for younger and more efficient power plants, we could be looking at refitting the plant, particularly with carbon capture and storage. But the third thing, and this particularly applies in cases, as in Ontario, where the plants are older, not so efficient, that retiring or phasing out of coal is certainly an option. Now, I know many of you have probably heard of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. It's an alliance headed up by the UK and Canada, encouraging countries to get out of coal-fired power generation altogether. There are in fact 36 nations have signed up for that, of which 20 had, at least when they signed up, had coal plants operating at the time. And of those 20, 18 of them are member countries of the International Energy Agency. So it's no surprise that the IEA takes a big interest in what is happening with respect to coal phase out, and in particular, what's happened in Ontario. Because we certainly believe that coal phase out is something that we can all learn from. And I think this is certainly bringing this case forward today is certainly a very topical issue. And so now, to date, these countries don't account for much of the world's coal demand. In fact, those 20 countries only account for 4% of the coal electricity generation in the world. But we do think these good examples can be used to other countries in the future. Now, as mentioned by Andy at the outset, I was actually in Ontario at the time, and certainly I have my own set of lessons that I could draw from this, and I think could be applied to others. And the first from the Ontario experience that I think people should be aware of is that if you're thinking about doing a coal phase-out policy, that you need to set realistic timeframes. The original policy actually was announced, it was an election promise in 2003, was to phase out the coal by 2007. That was later delayed to 2009 and then finally 2014. Much better if you start with a realistic timeframe at the outset to deal with the issues around replacement capacity, to deal with the labor issues, and to deal with community issues, and particularly in the case when you have, unlike Ontario, coal mining that's being affected. I would note in the case of Germany, which is implementing a coal phase-out plan, its coal commission in 2018 recommended a phase-out date in 2038, 20-year period. So these things do take time. Second point, which I know was touched on just very briefly, but really should not be forgotten, is don't forget about transmission. lot of focus on the replacement of resources. In the case of Ontario, a lot of the energy replacement came from nuclear, but gas playing a very key role, which I'll touch on in a moment. And of course, renewables, I think in many countries going forward will play a much bigger role. But transmission is needed to knit it all together. Especially in a system where demand isn't growing much, you're really reconfiguring your whole power system, and you need to pay attention to the transmission implications as part of your phase-out plan. And finally, as has been emphasized here today, when you make a commitment, particularly when you make a commitment to phase out coal in these contexts, gas will become key to the reliability of your power system. And so you need to have a reliable gas system to have a reliable power system. Now that actually entails a couple of things. Number one, it actually means that you have to pay attention to the flexibility of the gas supply system so that it can have the gas generators play the flexible role that they need. And in fact, in Ontario, we had to do that because the gas generation had been a relatively small component of power generation up till that time. And we did reform the gas supply system so that gas generators could get gas in a timely way to meet the flexibility requirements that were going to be needed with the new system. And then while in the end, there's surprisingly little gas, extra gas that was required, the flexibility remains important. And finally on this point, as Andy's reminder on Texas last month, you need to make sure that gas system's reliable. That your energy system reliability is becoming dependent on your gas system, and you need to make sure you have a critical look at the security of your gas supply in order to have a secure power supply. Now, the IEA is as I mentioned, very engaged on clean energy transitions. And I should note that right now we're undertaking a study looking at coal phase outs in Ontario and in other jurisdictions to determine what other lessons we could learn and help those countries that are implementing their coal phase out transitions today and those tomorrow. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Andy. Thanks.
Peter, thank you. Thank you for you like Usman and Chuck ooze experience at a global level, and also at an Ontario level. My challenge now is we've got some great questions, and I'm going to shoot a question at somebody, and you've got 30 seconds to 45 seconds max to answer it. Okay. So the first question is to you, Chuck, from Jacob Klimstra. How much do the gas system costs rise caused by the strongly fluctuating demand?
So how much do the gas system costs rise? So I mean, when you look at the pricing of electricity, you're really looking at a stack of resources. The reality in Ontario is because we had largely contracted for an extended period of time, most of our generation, more than 95% of it is under a long-term contract or regulated by the regulator. We tend to have a very fixed cost system. And so while we have benefited somewhat from the decline in the cost of natural gas itself, we don't see a lot of impacts from the fluctuating use of the gas plant. I do think using the gas fleet more will reduce costs a little bit as you'll get better utilization factors out of those plants.
Great, quick reply. Usman, question for you from Hafez Al-Sawami. Is electric mobility part of your energy efficiency plan, and how does that feature? 45 seconds.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think as I mentioned in my remarks, one of the things that we're doing as well is we're piloting different types of pricing plans. And one of the pricing plans that we're piloting is a plan that's geared towards electric vehicles. So a lower off-peak rate to encourage electric vehicles to charge up at off-peak times when we're primarily using baseload nuclear generation, which is clean. So that's one of the things that we're doing as well, to take the charging off of peak times when perhaps you would be using natural gas or a higher emitting resource.
Thank you. Peter, you spoke about looking at the energy and power systems in many countries. Which are the countries that like Ontario, which is not a country, but the other jurisdictions that you're looking at and studying on a comparative basis to draw your conclusions?
Well, our focus is mainly on the countries that have these policies or are in fact phasing it out even if they don't have the policy. So it's countries like, of course, the UK, which has a firm closure date of 2025, but where we find the carbon pricing has had a very important impact on phasing out the coal. Also in Spain, where last June, quite suddenly, the power companies decided to close down half the coal capacity. Other countries in Europe which have similar policies, Sweden, Austria have actually completed their phase outs. Others that are pretty advanced. So wherever there's a policy, we'll take a look at those.
Okay, another question from for you, Chuck Farmer, from Jacob Klimstra. Why do you not expect that wind and solar will increase a lot in the coming decades as per your graph?
So we actually, as we move forward, we're not really projecting the resource types in our installed capacity. So we have capacity gaps emerging, and we will hold competitions. We have a capacity auction that we run annually in the province, and anything that can provide capacity will be eligible to participate. We had a very significant build out of wind and solar over the last decade, supported by strong policy. Now it's much more competitive, and we're still seeing the prices of the wind and solar decline. So I would expect them to start to become competitive with other sources of capacity over time. But as of right now, there isn't a lot of policy support for additional wind and solar at this time.
Thank you. Usman, a question for you from Fevos Skalidis. Could you comment on Ontario's legal challenge of the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act? Now that's a complicated question and could be very long. Can you package it for us short?
Well, I won't comment on legal challenges, but I will answer the question by I guess sharing what Ontario is doing in order to drive towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You know, there's a lot of work that our Ministry of Environment has been doing in this regard. There's an environment plan that was released in November 2018 that's currently being refreshed, and we're looking at bolder ways to help reduce emissions. And what we're doing is we've set a target of reducing Ontario's emissions 30% below 2005 by 2030, and that equates to about 18 megatons of reduction. So yes, there's the the federal initiative, but Ontario is also working very hard towards meeting these goals.
Okay, thank you. Peter, a question for you. When countries phase out coal, how are they battling with the supply mix that replaces it between gas and renewables, and what plays on the energy minister's agenda?
Mm-hmm. Well, I actually think that Ontario is a good example showing that it's a combination of things, including on the demand side. And certainly when we do our sustainable development scenario and currently looking at our net zero scenario, energy efficiency is a big part of this, just to make the whole question of what to use more manageable. We've made great efforts in the last few years to look at variable renewable integration, because as the previous questioner had suggested, the costs of wind and solar, and particularly quite spectacularly the cost of solar, has become really inexpensive now. So it's going to those resources are going to tend to be preferred as part of the replacement. But then you need balancing resources, and of course, so for the foreseeable future, that's going to be gas, and gas will have to play that role, because you will not have coal able to play a flexible role in the system anymore.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Nafez Al Samami says, You didn't use the word hydrogen once. Is hydrogen part of the future energy mix of Ontario?
I would imagine that yes, it is. The federal government is developing a hydrogen strategy that focuses largely on the use of hydrogen in industrial uses and production of electricity in areas that are remote. In Ontario, we're also on the front end of developing a hydrogen strategy, and it's seen largely as an economic development tool. Hydrogen production will add demand to the system. I have no doubt of that. As of yet, it's hard to predict what that will look like. I think there will be a need to rely on the very sort of flexibility of hydrogen production so that it's taking electricity at times when that we have less demand, and so we're not stressing the system with it.
Andy, I'll just add on to
Yep.
Chuck's answer if I can. Definitely, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen in the province. We're also looking at piloting renewable natural gas opportunities where we would add hydrogen to the natural gas mix and seeing how that plays out. So these are things that we're continuing to work on, but definitely lots of interest in hydrogen moving forward.
Great, Usman. Seeing that you volunteered that, he has another question for you, Usman. Comes from Jacob Klimstra. Will gas heating of homes be replaced by electric heat pumps in Canada? So I give you that one because it's at the demand end of the spectrum.
Sure. Well, I think it comes down to economics. This is something we've heard before, and we've been kind of batting around. Heat pumps has been a big topic in Ontario. We have a lot of homes that are electrically heated in the northern part of the province, and in those situations, electric heat pumps make a lot of sense, economically for sure, and from an efficiency perspective. When you think about natural gas heated homes, the economics is not as strong. Natural gas in Ontario is relatively cheap in comparison to electricity. So I think if your home is heated by natural gas, you're probably one of the luckier ones. So I don't think there's a current plan to replace heating of homes that from natural gas with electric heat pumps because of the economics.
Okay. And closing question, Peter Fraser, I spent quite some time this morning in another call on China, and no conference call and webinar can be complete without just your perspective on coal and gas in China in a short moment, Peter.
Okay, well, gas is growing quite strongly in China, both in industrial uses and in home heating requirements. And so rather than it is growing as well in the power sector, but it's actually a relatively minor component. The gas is growing because China, until fairly recently, used coal for just about everything, including home heating. So this conversion to gas is helping to clean up their air, clean up their industry, and really that's the focus of the growth there rather than the power sector.
Thank you. Members of the audience, thank you for joining us today. We clearly heard that Ontario took a brave policy decision to phase out coal driven by clean air goals in the province of Ontario. They replaced coal with renewables, with gas, and with nuclear. And really, Ontario is playing a renewable energy leadership role in Canada. In the process, they've reduced CO2 emissions, they've reduced SOx emissions, they've reduced NOx emissions, and importantly, the power system remained stable or remained as stable as it was, even when tested by severe weather. And gas with a fast load following capability played that supply-demand balancing role, and the new arrangement would not have been possible without gas. At the same time, it is the energy scene in every country moves on, and as Chuck looked to 2035, it will continue to evolve. Thank you for joining us today. I hope it was a value-added session for our audience in so many countries, and a special word of me to our public affairs team of Matt Doman and Tatiana Kahnberg, who hosted us today. With that, thank you and good